Imagine sitting in a courtroom, the air thick with tension as a judge, someone meant to embody fairness and justice, looks down at a black man and delivers a remark so shocking, so blatantly racist, that the entire room falls silent. You could hear a pin drop. This wasn't just an offhand comment, it was a moment that would change everything. But what happened next? Well, let's just say the tables turned in a way no one could have predicted. This is the story of how a racist judge's arrogance led to her own downfall, and how justice, though delayed, found its way into that courtroom in the most unexpected way. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a small-town courthouse. The room was packed, lawyers shuffling papers, defendants nervously tapping their feet, and family members whispering prayers under their breath. At the center of it all was Marcus Johnson, a 34-year-old black man who had been wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. Marcus was no stranger to hardship. Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, he'd worked tirelessly to build a life for himself and his family. But now he found himself in a fight for his freedom, staring down a system that seemed stacked against him. Presiding over the case was Judge Linda Harper, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor and sharp tongue. She'd been on the bench for over 2 decades, and her reputation for being tough, some would say harsh, was well known. But what happened that day went far beyond tough. As Marcus stood before her, calmly explaining his side of the story, Judge Harper interrupted him with a sneer. "You people always have an excuse, don't you?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. The room froze. Marcus's lawyer immediately objected, but the damage was done. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and everyone present knew they'd just witnessed something deeply wrong. But here's where the story takes a turn. Just 7 minutes later, something extraordinary happened. As Marcus's lawyer was preparing to file a motion for mistrial, a group of federal agents walked into the courtroom. All eyes turned to them as they made their way to the bench. Judge Harper, visibly annoyed, demanded to know what was going on. What happened next left everyone in shock. The agents informed her that she was under arrest. The charges? Corruption, abuse of power, and, most shockingly, evidence of her involvement in a scheme to disproportionately target black defendants in her courtroom. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Marcus stood there, stunned, as the judge who had just insulted him was handcuffed and led away. But this wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was just the beginning. What unfolded in the days and weeks that followed would expose a web of corruption that went far beyond one judge's racist remarks. It would shine a light on a broken system and the people brave enough to fight back. So, what happened to Marcus? Did he get the justice he deserved? And what about Judge Harper? Was this the end of her reign, or was there more to her story? Stick around, because this tale is far from over. The next part of this story will take you deeper into the courtroom drama, the investigation that brought it all to light, and the lives that were forever changed by what happened that day. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. As the federal agents led Judge Harper out of the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. People were whispering, some even recording the scene on their phones. Marcus Johnson stood there, his mind racing. He had come to court that day expecting to fight for his freedom, but he never imagined he'd witness something like this. His lawyer, a seasoned attorney named Sarah Bennett, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "But this changes everything." To understand how things had reached this point, we need to go back, way back. Marcus's story didn't start in that courtroom. It started in a small, tight-knit community where he grew up. Marcus was the kind of guy who always tried to do the right thing. He worked 2 jobs to support his family, coached a youth basketball team on weekends, and was known for his easy smile and willingness to help others. But life wasn't easy. The neighborhood he called home was underfunded and overlooked, a place where opportunities were scarce and the odds were often stacked against you. The trouble began one evening when Marcus was walking home from work. He was stopped by the police, who claimed he matched the description of a suspect in a recent robbery. Marcus knew he had nothing to do with it, but he was arrested anyway. The evidence against him was flimsy, a grainy surveillance video and a witness who later admitted they weren't sure it was him. But the system moved quickly, and before he knew it, Marcus was facing charges that could put him behind bars for years. That's when Sarah Bennett entered the picture. A fierce advocate for justice, Sarah had built her career fighting for people like Marcus, people who were often overlooked or unfairly targeted by the system. When she took on his case, she quickly realized something wasn't right. The prosecution's case was weak, but Judge Harper seemed determined to push it forward. Sarah had heard rumors about Harper's courtroom being particularly harsh on black defendants, but she didn't have proof. Not yet, anyway. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Marcus or Sarah, an investigation into Judge Harper had been quietly underway for months. It started with a tip from a court clerk who had noticed a disturbing pattern. Black defendants in Harper's courtroom were receiving harsher sentences than their white counterparts for similar offenses. The tip led to a deeper probe. And what investigators uncovered was shocking. Harper wasn't just biased. She was allegedly involved in a scheme with a local bail bondsman and a private prison company. The scheme was simple but devastating. Target black defendants, impose excessive bail amounts, and funnel them into a private prison where the company profited from their incarceration. The investigation was led by Agent Daniel Reyes, a no-nonsense federal agent with a reputation for taking down corrupt officials. Reyes had seen a lot in his career, but even he was taken aback by the scale of what Harper was allegedly involved in. This wasn't just about one judge, he later said. It was about an entire system that had been rigged to exploit vulnerable people. Back in the courtroom, as the shock of Harper's arrest began to settle, Marcus and Sarah knew they had to act fast. Sarah immediately filed a motion to dismiss the charges against Marcus, citing judicial misconduct. But the prosecution wasn't ready to back down. They argued that Harper's arrest had no bearing on Marcus's case, and that the evidence against him, flimsy as it was, should still be considered. The judge who replaced Harper, a soft-spoken man named Judge Michael Carter, had a reputation for being fair and impartial. But even he seemed unsure of how to proceed. "This is uncharted territory," he admitted during a hearing. "We need to tread carefully." As the legal battle dragged on, Marcus found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, he felt a glimmer of hope. Harper's arrest had exposed the corruption that had been lurking in the shadows, and people were starting to pay attention. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it was making headlines across the country. Advocacy groups rallied behind Marcus, calling for justice not just for him, but for all the others who had been wronged by Harper's actions. But on the other hand, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. His future was still hanging in the balance, and the legal process was moving at a snail's pace. He missed his family, his wife Jasmine and their 2 young kids who were struggling to make sense of everything. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" his daughter had asked during a phone call. It was a question he couldn't answer, and it broke his heart. Meanwhile, the investigation into Harper was uncovering even more disturbing details. Emails, financial records, and witness testimonies painted a picture of a judge who had abused her power in the worst possible way. But Harper wasn't acting alone. The bail bondsman, a man named Carl Dixon, was also arrested, as were several others connected to the private prison company. It was a sprawling network of corruption, and it seemed like every new piece of evidence led to more questions. One of the biggest questions was how Harper had gotten away with it for so long. How had no one noticed the pattern of bias in her courtroom? And why had it taken so long for someone to speak up? These were questions that Agent Reyes and his team were determined to answer. But as they dug deeper, they realized that the corruption went beyond Harper. It was a systemic issue, one that would take more than a few arrests to fix. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus's case became a symbol of the larger fight for justice. People from all walks of life were following his story, rooting for him, and demanding change. But for Marcus, it was personal. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more complicated, a new development emerged. A key witness in Marcus's case came forward with shocking information. Information that could completely change the trajectory of the trial. But before the witness could testify, they disappeared. Where did they go? What did they know? And how would this new twist impact Marcus's fight for justice? The answers to these questions would come in the next chapter of this unfolding drama. But one thing was clear: the battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. So what happens next? Will Marcus finally get the justice he deserves? Or will the forces working against him prove too powerful to overcome? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take another dramatic turn. As the days passed, the disappearance of the key witness in Marcus's case sent shockwaves through the legal community. Sarah Bennett was determined to find out what had happened. She spent hours poring over case files, interviewing anyone who might have information, and even reaching out to contacts in law enforcement. But the witness, a young man named Jamal Carter, seemed to have vanished without a trace. Jamal had been the one to come forward with evidence that could exonerate Marcus, but now, his absence cast a dark shadow over the case. Jamal's story was a complicated one. He had been in and out of trouble for most of his life, but he was trying to turn things around. When he heard about Marcus's case, he knew he had to speak up. Jamal had been in the area the night of the robbery and had seen the real suspect. Someone who looked nothing like Marcus. But coming forward wasn't an easy decision. Jamal knew there were risks, especially given the corruption that had already been exposed. Still, he believed it was the right thing to do. Now, with Jamal missing, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if his disappearance was connected to the case. Was someone trying to silence him? And if so, who? The timing was too suspicious to ignore. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone connected to Judge Harper's network? Or was there another player in the shadows, someone who hadn't yet been uncovered? Meanwhile, Marcus was struggling to hold on to hope. The uncertainty was taking a toll on him. He spent his days in a small, cramped cell, trying to stay strong for his family. Jasmine visited as often as she could, bringing updates about their kids and words of encouragement. But even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. "We're going to get through this," she told him during one visit. "You're innocent, and the truth will come out." Marcus wanted to believe her, but the weight of everything was crushing him. At the same time, Agent Daniel Reyes and his team were working tirelessly to unravel the full extent of the corruption. The investigation had expanded far beyond Judge Harper. They were now looking into other judges, law enforcement officials, and even local politicians who might have been involved. The deeper they dug, the more they realized how widespread the problem was. It wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about an entire system that had been rigged to exploit the most vulnerable. One of the most shocking discoveries came when they uncovered a series of encrypted emails between Harper and a high-ranking official in the private prison company. The emails detailed a plan to increase profits by targeting specific communities and ensuring longer sentences for certain defendants. It was a cold, calculated scheme, and it left Reyes and his team reeling. "This isn't just corruption," Reyes said during a briefing. "This is a betrayal of public trust on a massive scale." As the investigation gained momentum, the media frenzy around Marcus's case grew. News outlets were running daily updates, and social media was flooded with hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" and "End Corruption." People from all over the country were following the story, demanding accountability and change. Advocacy groups organized rallies and protests, calling for an overhaul of the justice system. It was a moment of reckoning, and the pressure was mounting on everyone involved, but not everyone was happy about the attention. Behind the scenes, there were whispers of retaliation. Sarah began receiving anonymous threats, warning her to back off the case. At first, she tried to brush them off, but when her office was broken into and her files were tampered with, she knew she had to take them seriously. She reported the incidents to the police, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Marcus, too, felt the tension rising. One night, as he lay in his cell, he overheard two guards talking in hushed tones. "They're not going to let him walk," one of them said. "Too much at stake." Marcus's heart sank. Were the guards talking about him? And if so, what did they mean by too much at stake? He wanted to confront them, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. Instead, he focused on staying strong and trusting Sarah to fight for him. As the trial date approached, Sarah knew she had to find Jamal. Without his testimony, the case would be much harder to win. She reached out to Jamal's family and friends, hoping someone might know where he was. What she learned only deepened the mystery. Jamal had been acting strangely in the days leading up to his disappearance. He had told his sister that he was scared, that he felt like someone was following him. But he wouldn't say who. Sarah's search led her to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, where Jamal had been staying. The room was empty, but there were signs of a struggle. A broken lamp, overturned furniture, and a phone smashed on the floor. Sarah's heart raced as she called the police. What had happened here, and where was Jamal? The discovery of the motel room added a new layer of urgency to the case. Sarah knew time was running out. She needed to find Jamal, not just for Marcus's sake, but for his own safety. But as she dug deeper, she began to uncover connections she hadn't expected. The motel was owned by a shell company with ties to the private prison industry. Was it a coincidence? Or was there something more sinister at play? Meanwhile, Marcus's trial was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. The prosecution was determined to push forward, despite the mounting evidence of corruption. Sarah was ready to fight, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The system was rigged, and the odds were stacked against them. As the courtroom filled on the first day of the trial, Marcus took a deep breath. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult battle, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Sarah was by his side, and people all over the country were rooting for him. Still, the question lingered in his mind. Would it be enough? And then, just as the judge was about to call the court to order, a commotion erupted in the back of the room. Everyone turned to see a man being escorted in by federal agents. It was Jamal. He looked shaken, but determined. Sarah's eyes widened, in surprise. What had happened to him? And what would his testimony reveal? The tension in the room was palpable as Jamal took the stand. But before he could say a word, the prosecution objected, and the judge called for a recess. The trial was put on hold, leaving everyone in suspense. What would Jamal say? And how would his testimony impact the case? The answers to these questions would shape the outcome of Marcus's fight for justice. But one thing was clear. The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. So what happens next? Will Jamal's testimony be the key to Marcus's freedom? Or will the forces working against them find a way to silence the truth? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take another dramatic turn. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Jamal Carter took the stand. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the wooden railing. Everyone in the room could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the testimony that could change everything. But before Jamal could utter a single word, the prosecution objected, claiming his sudden appearance was a stunt designed to manipulate the jury. Judge Carter, the replacement for the disgraced Judge Harper, called for a recess to review the situation. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah Bennett pulled Marcus aside. "This is our chance," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Jamal's testimony could blow this case wide open. But we need to be ready for anything. The prosecution isn't going to let this go easily." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore. It was about exposing the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Meanwhile, Jamal was escorted to a private room by federal agents. He looked shaken, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone to jump out at him. Agent Daniel Reyes was there, trying to calm him down. "You're safe now," Reyes assured him. "But we need to know what happened. Where have you been? Who took you?" Jamal hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know their names," he said. "But they knew everything. About me, about Marcus, about the case. They said if I talked, they'd make sure I disappeared for good." Reyes exchanged a glance with Sarah, who had just entered the room. This was bigger than they had thought. Someone was desperate to keep Jamal quiet, and that desperation only confirmed how important his testimony was. But time was running out. The recess wouldn't last forever, and they needed to be ready when the trial resumed. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Spectators whispered to each other. Reporters typed furiously on their laptops, and the prosecution huddled together, strategizing their next move. Marcus sat at the defense table, trying to steady his nerves. He glanced over at the jury, wondering what they were thinking. Did they believe in his innocence, or had the prosecution's narrative already taken root? When the trial resumed, Judge Carter ruled that Jamal's testimony would be allowed, but with strict limitations. The prosecution could cross-examine him aggressively, and they wasted no time doing so. They tried to paint Jamal as an unreliable witness, someone with a criminal past who couldn't be trusted. But Sarah was ready. She methodically walked Jamal through his story, drawing out the details that mattered most. Jamal explained how he had been in the area the night of the robbery and had seen the real suspect, a man with a distinctive tattoo on his neck. He described how he had tried to come forward earlier but was intimidated into silence. And then, with a shaky voice, he revealed the most shocking part of his story. The people who had taken him had shown him documents linking Judge Harper and others to a larger conspiracy. Documents that proved Marcus's arrest was no accident. It was part of a plan. The courtroom erupted. Judge Carter banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Jamal's testimony had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The prosecution scrambled to recover, but the jury was clearly shaken. Sarah could see it in their faces. They were starting to doubt everything they'd been told. But just as it seemed like the tide was turning, the prosecution dropped a bombshell of their own. They called a surprise witness to the stand, a man named Derek Mills, who claimed to have seen Marcus near the scene of the crime. Derek was calm and confident, his testimony direct and damning. Sarah's heart sank. She hadn't seen this coming. Who was this guy, and why was he lying? As Sarah cross-examined Derek, she noticed something odd. His story was too polished, too perfect. It didn't add up. But before she could press him further, Judge Carter called for another recess. The day was over, and the trial would resume tomorrow. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She spent hours going over the case files, trying to find a way to discredit Derek. But the more she looked, the more she realized how well prepared the prosecution was. They had anticipated every move, every angle. It was as if they had inside information. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his cell staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Derek's testimony had rattled him, but there was something about the man's demeanor that didn't sit right. Marcus had spent his life reading people, and Derek didn't strike him as someone telling the truth. But how could he prove it? The next morning, as the trial was about to resume, Sarah received a phone call that stopped her in her tracks. It was from an anonymous tipster, someone who claimed to have information about Derek Mills. The tipster said Derek had been paid to lie on the stand, and they had proof. Sarah's mind raced. Was this the break they needed? Or was it a trap? She didn't have time to think it through. The trial was starting, and she had to be ready. As she walked into the courtroom, she noticed Derek sitting in the witness box looking smug. But there was something different about him today. A nervous energy that hadn't been there before. Sarah's instincts kicked in. This was her chance. As she began her cross-examination, she carefully laid the groundwork, asking Derek seemingly innocuous questions about his background. Then, when the moment was right, she dropped the bombshell. "Mr. Mills," she said, her voice steady, "is it true that you were paid $10,000 to testify against my client?" The courtroom gasped. Derek's face went pale. He stammered, trying to deny it, but Sarah pressed on. "And isn't it true that the money came from an account linked to the private prison company involved in this case?" The prosecution objected, but the damage was done. The jury was visibly shaken, and even Judge Carter looked stunned. Sarah had just exposed a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone had imagined. But before she could finish her line of questioning, Derek suddenly stood up and shouted, "I don't have to answer this." He stormed out of the courtroom, leaving chaos in his wake. The trial was thrown into disarray. Judge Carter called for another recess, and the prosecution was left scrambling to recover. Sarah knew this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would finally come to light. But she also knew the fight wasn't over. The forces working against them were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "Now," she said, "we finish what we started." But the question remained. Would it be enough? With Derek's credibility shattered and Jamal's testimony exposing a web of corruption, the case was on the brink of a major breakthrough. But the stakes had never been higher, and the danger had never been greater. What happens next? Will Marcus finally get the justice he deserves? Or will the forces working against him find a way to silence the truth once and for all? Stay tuned, because the climax of this story is about to unfold, and you won't want to miss it. As the courtroom emptied and the chaos of Derek Mills's outburst settled, Sarah Bennett felt a mix of triumph and unease. She had exposed a crack in the prosecution's case, but something about Derek's reaction gnawed at her. He hadn't just been nervous, he had been terrified. And that fear suggested there was more to this story than even she had uncovered. Marcus, still processing the whirlwind of events, turned to Sarah as they stepped into the hallway. "What does this mean for us?" he asked, his voice tinged with both hope and exhaustion. Sarah hesitated. "It means we're closer to the truth," she said, "but we're not out of the woods yet. Derek's lies are just the tip of the iceberg. Someone paid him to lie, and that someone is still out there." Before they could discuss further, Agent Daniel Reyes approached them, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, pulling Sarah aside. "Something's come up." Reyes explained that during the recess his team had received an anonymous tip about a safe house connected to the private prison company. The tipster claimed there was evidence there that could blow the case wide open, evidence linking not just Judge Harper, but other high-ranking officials to the conspiracy. "We're moving on it tonight," Reyes said. "But I need to know if you're willing to help. This could be dangerous." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'm in," she said. Marcus, overhearing the conversation, insisted on coming too. "This is my life on the line," he said firmly. "I'm not sitting this one out." Reyes reluctantly agreed, but warned them both to stay close and follow his lead. That night, under the cover of darkness, the team made their way to the safe house, a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension as they approached, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Reyes signaled for silence as they reached the door. With a swift motion, he picked the lock, and they slipped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the walls lined with filing cabinets and stacks of documents. Sarah's eyes widened as she began to sift through the papers. What she found was staggering. Detailed records of payoffs, manipulated court cases, and even a list of names of people who had been targeted by the scheme. Marcus's name was on that list, along with dozens of others. But just as they were about to gather the evidence, a noise from the back of the room made them freeze. Reyes drew his weapon, motioning for Sarah and Marcus to stay behind him. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the light. It was Derek Mills. Derek looked even more disheveled than he had in court, his eyes wild with fear. "I didn't want any part of this," he said, his voice trembling. "But they made me do it. They said they'd kill me if I didn't cooperate." Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Who's they, Derek? Who's behind this?" Before Derek could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles outside made everyone tense. Reyes peered through the window and cursed under his breath. "We've got company," he said. "Looks like they know we're here." The team quickly gathered as much evidence as they could carry, but it was clear they were running out of time. Derek, panicking, begged to come with them. "They'll kill me if they find me here," he pleaded. Reyes hesitated, then nodded. "Stay close," he said, "and don't do anything stupid." As they made their way to the back exit, the sound of voices and footsteps grew louder. Whoever was outside was closing in fast. Reyes led the group through a narrow alley, but as they reached the end, they were met with a blinding set of headlights. A black SUV blocked their path, its doors swinging open to reveal armed men. Sarah's heart raced as she realized they were trapped. Marcus gripped her arm, his face pale but determined. "What do we do now?" he asked. Reyes tightened his grip on his weapon, his eyes scanning for an escape route. "We fight," he said. But before the situation could escalate further, a familiar voice called out from the shadows. "Put your weapons down." The group turned to see none other than Carl Dixon, the bail bondsman who had been arrested alongside Judge Harper. He stepped into the light, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I'm here to make a deal." The revelation left everyone stunned. Carl Dixon, one of the key players in the corruption scheme, was offering to cooperate. But why now? And could he be trusted? As the armed men lowered their weapons, Carl explained that he had been double-crossed by his partners. "They left me to take the fall," he said bitterly. "But I've got information that can bring them all down. Names, dates, bank accounts, everything. You need to take this whole operation apart." Sarah exchanged a glance with Reyes. This could be the break they needed, but it came with risks. Carl's sudden change of heart was suspicious, and there was no guarantee he wasn't setting them up. But with the evidence they had already gathered and the threat of the armed men still looming, they didn't have much of a choice. "We'll hear you out," Reyes said cautiously, "but if this is a trick, you're going to regret it." As the group made their way to a secure location, the tension was palpable. Carl's cooperation could be the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy, but it also meant they were diving deeper into a dangerous game. The stakes had never been higher, and the line between ally and enemy had never been blurrier. What happens next? Will Carl's information lead to the downfall of the corruption network? Or is this just another layer of deception in a web of lies? The answers are coming, but one thing is certain. The fight for justice is far from over, and the next move could change everything. Stay tuned, because this story is about to reach its boiling point, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The safe house was eerily quiet as Carl Dixon laid out the evidence on a makeshift table. His hands trembled slightly as he handed over a flash drive to Agent Daniel Reyes. "Everything's on there," Carl said, his voice low but urgent. "Names, transactions, even recordings of meetings. It's enough to take down everyone involved." Sarah Bennett watched him closely, her instincts on high alert. Carl's sudden willingness to cooperate felt too convenient, but the evidence he provided was undeniable. As Reyes plugged the flash drive into a laptop, the screen lit up with files. Hundreds of them. There were spreadsheets detailing payoffs, audio recordings of incriminating conversations, and even photos of high-ranking officials meeting with known criminals. Sarah's eyes widened as she scrolled through the documents. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what we've been looking for." But just as they began to celebrate the breakthrough, the sound of approaching sirens shattered the moment. Reyes rushed to the window, his face hardening, as he saw a convoy of black SUVs speeding toward the safe house. "We've got to move," he said, grabbing the laptop and shoving the flash drive into his pocket. Now, the group scrambled to gather the evidence and make their escape. Marcus Johnson stayed close to Sarah, his heart pounding as they followed Reyes out the back door. Carl hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting toward the approaching vehicles. "They're not going to let me walk away from this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. As they ran through the darkened alley, the sound of shouting and footsteps grew louder behind them. Reyes led the group to a waiting van, its engine already running. "Get in," he barked, shoving Sarah and Marcus inside before climbing into the driver's seat. Carl hesitated again, his face pale with fear. "I can't," he said. backing away. "They'll kill me if I go with you." Before anyone could stop him, Carl turned and bolted back toward the safe house. Reyes cursed under his breath, but didn't have time to argue. He slammed the van into gear and sped away, the sound of gunfire echoing in the distance. Back at the safe house, Carl was met by a group of armed men. Their leader, a cold-eyed man in a tailored suit, stepped forward. "You really thought you could betray us and get away with it?" he sneered. Carl raised his hands in surrender, but there was no mercy in the man's eyes. Meanwhile, Reyes, Sarah, and Marcus raced toward the federal building, the evidence safely in their possession. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, but Reyes assured her they were in the clear. "We've got what we need," he said. "Now it's time to bring this whole thing crashing down." When they arrived at the federal building, Reyes immediately called for an emergency meeting with his superiors. The evidence was overwhelming, and within hours, warrants were issued for the arrest of several high-ranking officials, including a state senator and a prominent businessman with ties to the private prison industry. The media was alerted, and the story exploded across the news. Marcus watched it all unfold in stunned silence. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. "Is it over?" he asked Sarah, his voice trembling. She smiled, though her eyes were still wary. "It's not over yet," she said, "but we're closer than we've ever been." The next day, Marcus's trial resumed. With the new evidence and the arrests making headlines, the prosecution's case fell apart. The judge dismissed the charges against Marcus, declaring him a free man. The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Marcus felt numb. He turned to Sarah, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. She hugged him tightly, her own emotions threatening to spill over. But just as they were leaving the courthouse, a final twist unfolded. A news alert flashed on a nearby screen. Carl Dixon had been found dead in an apparent suicide. The report claimed he had left a note confessing to his role in the corruption scheme, but Sarah and Reyes exchanged a knowing glance. They both knew the truth. Carl had been silenced. As they walked away from the courthouse, Marcus took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of freedom. But the fight wasn't over. The corruption ran deep, and there were still battles to be fought. Sarah and Reyes were determined to see it through no matter the cost, and so the story ended, not with a neat resolution, but with the promise of justice on the horizon. Marcus was free, but the system that had tried to destroy him was still standing. The fight for change was just beginning, and the people who had fought so hard for Marcus's freedom weren't about to give up. As the sun set on the courthouse steps, Marcus looked out at the city he called home. He had survived the storm, but he knew there were others still caught in its grip, and he was determined to help them, just as Sarah and so many others had helped him. The battle for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he had a fighting chance, and that was enough. For now. Stay tuned, because this story isn't over. The fight for justice continues, and the next chapter promises to be even more intense. Don't miss it. The days following Marcus Johnson's acquittal were a whirlwind of emotions. After months of fighting for his freedom, he was finally able to return home to his family. Jasmine and the kids greeted him with tears and hugs, their relief palpable. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus allowed himself to breathe. But even as he settled back into the rhythm of everyday life, he couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. The fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. Sarah Bennett, too, was grappling with the aftermath. The evidence they had uncovered had sparked a wave of investigations, and the fallout was far-reaching. High-ranking officials were resigning, arrests were being made, and the public outcry for justice was louder than ever. But Sarah knew better than anyone that real change wouldn't happen overnight. The corruption they had exposed was deeply entrenched, and dismantling it would take time. Still, she felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. Marcus was free, and the truth had come to light. That was a start. One evening, Sarah visited Marcus at his home. They sat on the porch, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice gentle. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'm okay," he said. "But it's hard, you know? I keep thinking about all the people who didn't get the same chance I did. People like Jamal." Jamal Carter's disappearance still weighed heavily on both of them. Despite their best efforts, he had never been found. Sarah had spent countless hours following leads, but every trail had gone cold. It was a painful reminder of the dangers they had faced, and the risks that still existed for anyone who dared to speak out. "We'll keep looking for him," Sarah said firmly. "We're not giving up." Marcus nodded, but his thoughts were already turning to the future. He had spent so much of his life trying to build something better for his family, and now he had a chance to do more. "I want to help," he said, suddenly turning to Sarah. "I don't know how yet, but I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You already are," she said. "Your story has inspired so many people, and if you want to do more, we'll find a way." Meanwhile, Agent Daniel Reyes was busy coordinating the ongoing investigations. The evidence they had gathered had opened the door to a much larger case, one that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of individuals. It was a massive undertaking, but Reyes was determined to see it through. He had seen firsthand the damage that corruption could do, and he wasn't about to let it continue unchecked. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when they uncovered a series of encrypted emails between the private prison company and a powerful lobbying group. The emails revealed a coordinated effort to influence legislation and ensure harsher sentencing laws that disproportionately affected communities of color. It was a chilling reminder of how deep the corruption went, but it was also a crucial piece of the puzzle. With this new evidence, Reyes and his team were able to bring charges against several key players, including a former state senator and a high-profile lobbyist. As the investigations progressed, the public's demand for accountability grew louder. Protests and rallies were held across the country, with people calling for systemic change. Advocacy groups used Marcus's story as a rallying cry, pushing for reforms to the justice system and greater transparency in the courts. It was a movement that had been a long time coming, and Marcus found himself at the center of it. At first, he was hesitant to step into the spotlight. He had never sought attention or fame. He just wanted to live his life in peace. But as he listened to the stories of others who had been wronged by the system, he realized that his voice mattered. He began speaking at events, sharing his story and calling for change. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt and fear, but he knew it was the right thing to do. One of the most powerful moments came during a rally in front of the state capitol. Marcus stood on the stage, looking out at a sea of faces. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about all of us, about making sure that no one else has to go through what I did, about holding people accountable and fighting for a system that actually works for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. It was a moment of unity and hope, a reminder that change was possible. As the months passed, the impact of their efforts began to show. New legislation was introduced to address sentencing disparities and increase oversight in the courts. The private prison company at the center of the scandal was shut down, and its assets were seized. And while there were still challenges ahead, there was a sense of momentum, a feeling that they were moving in the right direction. For Marcus, life slowly began to return to normal. He went back to work, spending his days coaching basketball and mentoring young people in his community. But he never forgot the lessons he had learned or the people who had stood by him. He made it a point to stay involved, working with advocacy groups and speaking out whenever he could. Sarah, too, found a new sense of purpose. She continued to take on cases that others might shy away from, fighting for those who couldn't fight, for themselves. And while the work was often difficult, she knew it was worth it. As for Agent Reyes, he remained committed to the fight. The investigations were far from over, but he was determined to see them through to the end. "This is just the beginning," he said during a press conference. We're not going to stop until we've rooted out every last trace of corruption. The story of Marcus Johnson and the corrupt judge who tried to destroy him had come to an end, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It was a story of resilience, of courage, and of the power of truth. And while the fight for justice was far from over, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. As Marcus stood on the porch of his home one evening watching his kids play in the yard, he felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had faced the storm and come out stronger on the other side, and he knew that as long as he kept fighting, he could make a difference. The story of Marcus Johnson wasn't just about one man's fight for justice. It was about the power of community, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the belief that change is possible. And as the sun set on another day, Marcus knew that his story was just the beginning. The fight for justice continues, and the next chapter is yours to write. Stay tuned because the best is yet to come.